Hello, I'm Mark Baer. Welcome to the Joe Cupcake Chronicles. We are in episode 4, part 3, Joe's Checkered Present. In this episode, Joe is back in Hollywood pitching movies and listening to other people pitch movies and trying to get his movie made along with the waiter, the busboy, the guy who drives his car, and everybody else in Hollywood. That is the way of Hollywood. I mention movies here because in this episode, Joe gets to live in some of his favorite movies, and The Sweet Smell of Success, written by Clifford Odette, a snarky movie, and American Beauty. Joe, in his imperfection, is a lot like Lester Burnham. He's not quite as desperate as Lester Burnham, but Joe and Lester Burnham, Kevin Spacey's character, have a lot in common, just longing for some kind of beauty that seems beyond the grasp and coming to grips that life is fleeting and he better grab it at the moment. America, oh beautiful for spacious skies, for amber waves of grain. Crown thy good in brotherhood. Hey buddy, can you spare a dime? It was a harsh time in the heartland, but in LA, it was all a movie. On the PCH, Joe passed a red Maserati that had been pulled over by the highway patrol. Behind the wheel, a stunning blonde with short Jean Seberg hair was showing her actor's glossies in lieu of her driver's license. As Joe passed, she flashed him a saucy smile, and before his eyes sprang forth an entire ballet. Lovers forgotten and lovers that might have been, given the right place and the right time. Gazing down over the blue and green checkered Pacific, he nibbled on ahi tuna tartare. Jeffrey's in Malibu, very old Hollywood, with an assortment of tan 60-year-old men in leather sandals with their 5-year-olds in tow, wife number 3 or 4. He eavesdropped on a producer on a date with a publicist. He'd have to change his wardrobe, his look, his style, she was saying, now that he was signing with a new agency, and she'd handle it all. Joe caught the producer's eye. The message was he was happy in jeans and a polo shirt and wasn't ever going to change. Joe knew if he came out and said this, he wasn't going to get laid. The producer started to protest and said, "What do you think, Prada, Armani? And maybe I should dye my hair." She clasped his hand and said, "We'll start with the nails." At the next table, a not unfamiliar sexual drama. The guy accused his girlfriend of cheating. She tried to cobble together a story, her words a jigsaw of deceits like glass cascading from a broken mirror that wouldn't piece back together. Finally, she indignantly confessed. She refused to have sex with her ex, but she did let him go down on her. Joe imagined himself in the young man's part, probably sniveling and banging his fist into walls, and he thought of a long-ago girlfriend. They were parked in a Kmart parking lot. She cried and said she felt deformed. The tip of her little finger had been cut off. But Joe had never noticed. What Joe did notice was that she was unhinged. He remembered one night when she was mad at him, tires squealing around a parking structure in a fit of anger. When she found his car, she smashed into it, backed up, and smashed into it again. That Joe noticed, but she was so sexy. Joe didn't know what to make of any of this, or of his own life, but the hope was that all the threads would come together in the third act. He imagined some lofty dialogue. "I hear you made a pilgrimage to the White Island in the Black Sea," says the cuckolded lover. "But I knew there was no truth to that story. You didn't ride in the well-rowed galleys, and you didn't reach the walls of Troy. She replies defiantly, and there was much more I didn't do, and much more I did. Joe considered how to proceed with his text and decided he would look for everything arcane, superfluous passages which could be cut, and then he would shine a light on those things and make them the very focus of his production. There would be plenty of bubbles, but what about the hero? A man of action, a great doer, a profound thinker, a warrior or a genius saving the world with a new serum, or a theory, or a IPO. What would Joe know about any of that? Joe wanted to be a hero, but he wasn't heroic. He was an ordinary Joe, chock full of base instincts, complicated survival mechanisms, and delusional blind spots where objects were always closer than they appeared. Maybe the hero would be a man who could put together a bouquet of flowers with a deft and effortless touch. He could step into a flower shop and create fabulous works of art spontaneously. Lemon yellow carnations, one speckled red and white carnation, a scarlet rose, a sprig of fern. And at the same time, Joe would be muy macho. Why not? He would have a stunt double. He saw a tropical locale, bright colors and moral decay, and his character would be as colorful as the flowers. Joe saw verandas and fans and himself in white linen and thought, Across the Pacific, a minor film, short on plot but oozing in atmospherics, with Humphrey Bogart, Mary Astor, and Sidney Greenstreet, directed by John Huston. Huston didn't finish the film. He left abruptly to join the war effort, stranding Bogart's character in a plantation in Panama, facing the climactic shootout without even a script left behind. Huston, undaunted, told the replacement director not to worry. Bogey will figure out how to get out of this mess. And Joe would too. First thing he'd do is move the set to the South Seas. No mosquitoes or swamps. Joe liked big totems, and his on-screen doppelganger would have all the accoutrements of a shaman and be lethal with a poisoned dart. In his viewfinder, Joe saw two lovers alone on a high bluff. The scenery demanded a shifting set of mirrors and trompe-l'oeil walls, and he wouldn't chintz on the set designer or on the wardrobe team, or flowers, come to think of it. Joe wrote in his notebook, lampshades of various op art patterns, and teeth whitener, and again he underlined whiter teeth. Then he envisioned the last scene. A massive tribal head rises out of the water to cast an awesome shadow over the land, to say, beware, bow in front of me and tremble, bow or else. Bow wow, bow wow wow, Chef Michael. One must lose everything in order to gain everything. Become an empty vessel, still, without text, just wind, clouds. It's good, 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 like Bridget Bardot. July, the first hot days. The moths were still nibbling. And while Joe stared at the moths, he thought about the demanding food and travel critic who had stayed at his house during a time when his wife was out of town, which meant disarray, and he laughed at the image of that fat, lazy fly in his guest's wine glass. She was phobic about germs, and he'd had an infestation of flies in the house. They weren't noticeable the night before, but when Joe woke up the next morning, they were everywhere. He was able to kill most of them before she woke. He swept around her room, vacuumed the rest. He had plenty of energy. She'd brought her own coffee from Costa Rica. She was out like a log. It seems she'd been up late. He'd got her stoned, and she cleaned the bathtub and sink. Who knew the hot water was out in the guest house? he'd forgotten to order propane. The way he told this story to a friend, the punchline was, "If I'd known how finicky she was, I would have changed the sheets." Joe made it sound as if he'd not changed the sheets as a matter of spite. But truth was, only one person had slept in that bed previously, and only for one night. How not fresh could her bed have been? Not like you'd like this to happen to you at the Holiday Inn, and of course the critic must have sensed this because she did ask if the sheets were clean, and Joe acted all offended. Like, what kind of host did she think he was? But the story leads us back to those big sluggish flies. Joe had talked to his wife later on about this, and she said that variety of flies only hatch when something is dead, most likely a decomposing rat in the wall. Joe wondered if this faux pas cost him a star on the bed and breakfast circuit. Joe, half man, half wit. Perhaps what was unique about Joe was that he had an interior laugh track. It wasn't a mean laugh or a judgmental laugh. Joe was not out to get anybody. He wasn't laughing at or with, or even at himself. He was a simple man with few moving parts who was easily entertained. At Joe's writers' group, a man read a sad, sensitive poem about breaking up with his girlfriend. They'd gone on a picnic by a river, and in the end, there was nothing left to say, as so often is the case when the love flame is blown out by one of the parties, usually the chick. In this case, Joe's friend had just gotten the big kiss off, and while the others in the group sat in quiet contemplation, no doubt the appropriate and intended response, Joe burst out laughing and improvised an addendum. "I'll miss her," he said to himself, as he knocked the dirt off his shovel before tossing it back into the trunk of the Toyota. Clifford Odets wrote most of the juicy lines for 1957's Sweet Smell of Success, starring Tony Curtis and Burt Lancaster. "I love this dirty town. My right hand hasn't seen my left hand in 30 years. I'd hate to take a bite out of you. You're a cookie full of arsenic." Joe loved this kind of talk. The honesty about what it said about the human condition, about the rottenness just below the surface. Joe sees himself on the big screen. The maitre d' sits him at a table with imperious, Winchellesque J.J. Hunsaker and his lackey, Sidney Falco. Joe looks killer in his checkered suit with padded shoulders, gloriously corrupt, deliciously twisted, devilishly naughty, elegantly tainted, a high-tone, high-stepping, street-wise night owl with brass nuts. "Match me, Sidney," he orders Falco, and then blows the smoke at Hunsaker. "You want to know how to be happy, JJ? I'll tell you. Live as a poor man, but with lots of dough." Hunsaker, not sure if he's being mocked, snatches a dossier from Falco for the next day's scoop of his gossip rag, a story about Joe. The headline, "Venal." Joe, quick to condemn others to assholes anonymous in their 12 excuse program, is thin-skinned about his own foibles. He smiles like he has nothing to hide, notices the ring on Hunsaker's pinky, flushes when he recalls the time he cavalierly asked his mother if he could have his dying grandmother's diamond ring. He could have been no more than 12 or 13, but he coveted the bling, and his mother was horrified. And Joe, also horrified, is even more horrified when Sidney Falco says, "And Joe, what about that time on Hollywood Boulevard?" Oh yeah, that, another shameful item, best abandoned in the cloakroom of memory. A bright, shiny object, a greedy grasp. A hepcat wearing a beret lured Joe between two buildings to reveal a gold ring with a big, shiny diamond. The price tag was still on the ring, several $1,000s. He told Joe it was hot, and Joe snapped at it, forking out $100, which he had to borrow from the friend he was with. Joe wore the ring for months, thinking he was quite the little big shot, the cherry in the pie, the oyster in the stew, until one day he entered a jewelry store to have his ring appraised. Joe asked the jeweler what it was worth. "Not much," the jeweler replied after putting down his loop. The glass is cracked. Sure enough, even to the naked eye, there was a chunk missing. What a sucker, Joe, king of the lollipops. And he could hear Daffy Duck say, "You're despicable." His only hope was that Mr. Rogers loved him just the way he was. There has only been one perfect person, said the politician on TV. We know who he means. We know what he means. We take it at face value. But how perfect is perfect? How much fun would it be hanging out with Mr. P? Hey, Jesus, we're at a Pinot Noir. Would you mind topping off the bathtub? Would he be all humble and go for the $2 chuck? Or would he uncork the good stuff? Would he be plain spoken like a boring uncle from the sticks, or witty like Oscar Wilde? Would he eyeball the babes or act neutered? Sure, JC Super Stud could give ladies orgasms just by laying on hands, but would he let you post the video on YouTube? On the golf course, would he be Mr. Rules and call you out if you rolled your ball out of a divot? Or be a prankster who would wait until you were putting to lift his robe to reveal he's wearing women's panties? Would he be a party no or a party pro who would boogaloo across the swimming pool, last one naked, a rotten egg? Would he leave the party early or still be raging next morning and make everyone hold hands and usher us into an old grove to behold fresh leaves on ancient branches, and there would be a rainbow in a paisley sky, and box and bagels for breakfast? But love thy neighbor as thyself? Well, sure, if he lived in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood and Mr. Rogers was his neighbor. But then he imagined Mr. Rogers in his shower with him while he was lovingly lathering up down there with the shampoo when enjoying a morning tug like Lester Burnham, Kevin Spacey's character in American Beauty. Funny, but no, Mr. Rogers would have to go. But why? Lester Burnham touched him so deeply. Was another matter. Joe was Lester, although not so desperate or doomed. But the themes of getting older and failure and lusting after bodies no longer available and the urge to run wild and not care about anything resonated. Lester, like Joe, was a decent fellow caught in a crisis of clarity. He wants beauty and pleasure and what once made him feel good, and he rushes pell-mell toward what he has to do to save himself. Joe made sense to himself after that movie and cried as a Beatles song played over the end credits and marveled at the sunset driving home. Max Jacobs said, "The poet's expression of joy conceals his despair at not having found the reality of joy." Max gave reality to illusion with whimsy, satire, parody, and dreams to recombine elements of experience into non-sequential and impossible forms. The very essence of cubism. Sadly, though, in the 1920s, Picasso broke Max's heart. Picasso's wife Olga frowned on the old crowd, and the maestro himself had taken to hobnobbing with the gratin. Max Jacob wrote this note to Picasso, who had locked the scruffy poet out of his new apartment on St. Valentine's Day. The gate was open, but the grill was locked. I had brought flowers, cigars, and candy. The candy has been smoked, the flowers eaten, and the cigars have faded. Joe knew it is only by the deepest suffering that one acquires the authority of the comic. This was truer of no man more than Eddie, a man who had suffered at the hands of love. "I told her she reminded me of a piece of beef jerky in a blonde wig. Was that too much?" This was his friend Eddie pouring out his heart about his longtime ex-girlfriend. They were on the golf course, and Eddie had just gone eagle birdie, so he was feeling good about life. It had been a bad year. His mother's death, a life-threatening illness, financial upheaval, and he'd put his dog to sleep. He spoke about feeding his dog a hamburger for a last meal, how his dog licked his tears to try to make him feel better. They talked about his longtime girlfriend before this last one. Their relationship ended when she told him she was pregnant by another man. She married, had kids, but one night called Eddie and said that she'd always loved him. If not, she wouldn't have named her kids after Eddie's cats. Then, back to the girlfriend, Joe said, "Piece of beef jerky and a blonde wig? She'll be in therapy for years." Well, maybe I did go too far, Eddie considered, before smacking a 5-iron 210 yards over a water carry to snuggle next to the pin. "Oh, baby, baby, birdie, birdie." Eddie had a couple more flare-ups about his ex during the round, but each time Joe talked him down, warning him that any superfluous tension would mess with his putting. Eddie stayed steady, but a few days later, he sent Joe a link to a celebrity news site. There was his ex, holding hands with a famous pop songwriter. The answer to why she discarded him, and when they spoke, Eddie's first words, "Now I know why Kirby blew his brains out." Kirby, her former husband, and Eddie's former friend. "She drove him to it," Eddie seethed. "And this dude's over 70 and a foot shorter than her. What's she thinking?" The obvious was obvious. In the picture, they were boarding his celebrity jet. "He looks in pretty good shape," Joe said. "He last married his personal trainer, and he's still big in Italy." "Who writes this stuff, man?" Eddie laughed. "It's so perfect. And so sick." Joe twinkled in. "And so awful. And so beautiful." Hilarity is essential for the preservation of the species. Ours is a laughing God with a laughing heart. And the thing we have learned is this: be who you are in your deep heart's core. High thoughts must have high language. Let us heed the words of the Persian poet Rumi. Sit, be still, and listen, for you are drunk, and we are at the edge of the roof. Yes, my sweet, on the edge, and buzzed, intoxicated with love, with joy, with life, with laughter. Blessed are the laughers, blessed are the laugh makers. Joe's son made him laugh. "Yeah, Dad." There was loud, shrill shrieking coming from the neighbor's house. They were at it again. Gregory, the dapper field mouse, groused at his wife, Ethel, in her prim white apron, daintily wiping her whiskers after having eaten 6 of her 8 newborns. Unfortunately, while this story about a family of fictional mice played out in Joe's son's imagination, it was not getting written down at any urgent pace, as was his son's way. Joe's son was stuck. Like much of the 20-something generation, he wants to go from point A to point C, but can't figure out point B. Last week, he dreamed his building melted and fell to the ground in a heap of rubble. He escaped, but couldn't find his dog. He scoured the desolate landscape looking for his dog, but couldn't find him. Shaken, grief-stricken, he was about to call off the search when he saw his dog running toward him. His dog wore a backpack and had a note attached. "Sorry I'm late, Dad. I've taken a job at a bookstore." Joe's son laughed. If only I could get a job at a bookstore. Joe told him to write down his dreams. His son considered this and said, "I wish I could describe the visuals, how the walls melted." Joe told him about a Picasso painting titled Head of a Young Man, 1916, how it looked like his son, and then suggested he paint. Think big. Aspire to be great. It's within you. Somebody has to do it. Why not you, son? "Maybe," he says. "I've got to go. I'll call you later." Maybe, thinks Joe. Maybe not tomorrow. Maybe not next week. But maybe someday. Miles Davis Bop, 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 bop. Blessed are the iconic hipsters all. The Rite of Spring, Stravinsky, the future, 100 years ago. Such is the river of time. The ladies will always come and go, talking of Michelangelo. In Fellini's Satyricon, a freakish portrait of Roman Empire debauchery, the protagonist's words end in mid-sentence, and the picture cuts to the film's characters painted on a crumbling wall. A faded fresco, centuries of decay, then, now, and always. Time and chance take a toll. Things fall apart. The silver cord severs. The golden bowl cracks. The pitcher shatters at the spring. The wheel breaks at the well. We end in darkness. In darkness our name will be shrouded. But while there is breath, there is hope. All is vanity, vanity of vanities, meaningless, useless. But so what? Do not despair. Life is glorious. To everything a season, every season beautiful. You are the music while the music lasts. After a sad song, a glad song. At the height of the moth outbreak, Joe's wife told him that their trees would recover. He panicked, he wasn't sure. He'd called a tree service that told him just the opposite. For a couple $1,000 they would come out and spray. Well, Joe feared it was too late and did nothing. Time passed. Now the moths were gone. Joe's trees indeed recovered. On his birthday, Joe's wife gave him a card. Jingle jangle, jingle jangle, count the happies, not the candles. And so he stood in the corner of his garden, hands pressed together to give thanks. He could hear the river below and jumbled fragments of words from the Persian poet Rumi. The minute I heard my first love story, I started looking for you, not knowing how blind that was. Lovers don't finally meet somewhere, they're in each other all along. We come spinning out of nothingness, scattering stars like dust. There are hundreds of ways to kneel and kiss the ground. Let the beauty we love be what we do. He thinks, kneel, kiss the ground. Blessed is the creation. He thinks, blessed is this beautiful day. He thinks, why wait for a next world? What's wrong with this one? And he thought, thank you for everything. I have no complaints whatsoever. The world has never been a more compassionate place. A single person can make a difference. Believe, act, transcend. Om.